Well, on education, the SNP have protected free university tuition for Scottish students. But critics point to cuts to further education colleges as evidence that their record on education isn't all rosy. On healthcare, the SNP have scrapped prescription charges and protected free personal care for those aged 65 and over who need it. But they've regularly failed to meet their own A&E target on waiting times. The SNP government have frozen council tax rates at 2007 levels for 9 years. But they originally planned to replace this with local income tax. That hasn't happened. They also say they have protected those hardest hit by unfair Tory welfare cuts. But the Scottish Labour Party and Scottish Lib Dems say they could give public services a boost by using new powers to raise taxes. Right, well, let's get back to that issue. Why don't you do what people, even in that film, were demanding, which is raise income tax?
Can I just correct some of the mistakes in that?
Mistakes?
Well, let me take one or two. You said, for example, that we'd protected free education. We introduced free education in Scotland. We scrapped the back-end tuition fees. I remember I was First Minister at the time. You say we haven't met our waiting time targets for accident emergency.
Well, you haven't.
When we came to power, there was 87% of people were seen within the 4-hour period. It's now 95%.
Sure, but they're not the targets that have been set by the Scottish Government.
I'm just about to explain that point. The original target was 95%. As we were improving things, we set the target at 98%. Sure. So the only reason we haven't met the target is we've increased the target ratio.
It was too ambitious, the target, and you haven't
But what we
held
have
to
done
it.
is increased the performance by 8%. And, you know, the reason that the Scottish Government is popular, the reason that Nicola Sturgeon is outstandingly popular, is people know that. They know the record. And just saying, you haven't met a target, and ignoring the fact that the accident emergency times are 8% better than they were when we came to power.
If you set a target, that's what we're going to hold you to. I mean, if you state a target, then that's what we're going to judge you against.
I'm sorry, that's perhaps the BBC judgment. But I'm more interested in the judgment, the judgment of the Scottish people who say on health, on education, on public services.
Well, let's talk about education.
The SNP has a positive approval rating. Now, which other government do you know of in 9 years into office could make that?
But it's not factually wrong. That's what I'm saying. I accept what you're saying about the fact that you've improved the target, but you set the target, you've missed that target, and that's what we've judged you on. That's fair.
Well, the statement that we had protected
I'm going to come to education
instead of introducing free education was actually slightly misleading by normal BBC standards.
Let's talk, which we uphold to the highest level, Alex Salmond. Let's talk about education. Since you couldn't resist it. In terms of tuition fees, has that focus on keeping tuition fees free, not charging for tuition fees, actually damaged other areas of education in Scotland? Because a lot of the evidence shows that some of the poorer students from disadvantaged backgrounds have suffered because of closures to further education colleges, to cuts to teaching grants.
Well, can I just say why that figure's wrong? The figure can I just say why it's wrong? The focus is on the number of, quote, places, but the way you measure students in colleges in Scotland is not by places, it's by full-time equivalent teaching. That's the like for like. For example, if you were to change 4 two-hour courses a week into one full-time course, then that is not 4 courses going to 1 course. That is actually more teaching. And what the SNP have done is upheld the full-time equivalent teaching time.
Right,
and the justification for that...
Let's look at the numbers of actual students, though.
No, but I'm sorry, you're not going to look at the students, you're going to look at number of courses, which is a different thing.
These are figures from the Scottish Funding Council, and these are figures from the Educational Institute of Scotland. Since you came to power in 2007, and you wanted to increase the number of students, the number of students in Scotland's colleges has fallen by 152,000.
I beg your pardon, that's not the case. That's the number of places in colleges. It's full-time equivalent teaching has been held at the level that was promised. And the way
there are fewer places.
So the way you can judge this is that 92% of children in Scotland, a record ever, go on from school to positive destinations, which mean to higher education or indeed to work. And we have a higher record of people achieving that in Scotland than the rest of the UK, and a larger number of students in higher education, and a record ever number of students in certified courses, in degree-level courses. These are the statistics that really matter. And once again, instead of looking at that interpretation, people in Scotland know that's the case.
It's not an interpretation. I mean, these are from very respected institutes in Scotland who are judging you on your record.
Why do families in Scotland believe that the SNP record in education is right? Well, because families in Scotland know the difference it makes to have free education based on ability, as opposed to paying £9,000 a year and labelling future generations.
I understand that, but do you accept that further education colleges have suffered as a result of that? Yes, it's benefited certain students, but by the figures here, the official figures. No, I'm going to put this question to you.
FE colleges, you see, we have colleges in Scotland which have degree courses. This benefits colleges as well as universities.
Well, they are actually saying the Scottish Government's policy decision to prioritise higher education provision and full-time FE courses, and let me finish, for younger learners has had a knock-on impact on the types of part-time courses. So children from poorer backgrounds, from disadvantaged backgrounds, have lost out. The figures are there.
No, I don't accept it, because the whole point about full-time courses and degree-level courses and higher education courses, which are pursued in colleges as well as universities in Scotland, is it gets people into full-time employment. That is why the record of full-time employment for young people in Scotland is so good in comparison.
But you accept there are fewer you accept there are fewer places at colleges than there were.
No, what I think the measurement you should have is the equivalent of full-time education.
You're choosing a different measurement.
I'm sorry, because if you take, well, let me say again, if you look, everybody watching this will understand that 2, 4, 5-hour courses is entirely different from a degree-level course. That is one course, but it might be far more valuable for people to get recognised qualifications so as they get into work, as opposed to having limited.
Why are you being judged then
courses
by these institutions in Scotland? For instance, the Scottish Funding Council also says your record on poorer students at university, despite having free tuition for Scottish students, universities accepted fewer students from poorer backgrounds in Scotland than in England, Northern Ireland and Wales.
Well, I think that is a challenge for us, and how the SNP and Nicola Sturgeon is addressing that challenge is that we're committing to new legislation which is now through and on the statute books, which is going to make sure that universities respond to the need to have people from deprived backgrounds.
Right.
But I should say the number...
you haven't managed to do, which is why you've asked for a Commissioner for Fair Access.
No, sorry, that's not correct. The number of students from deprived backgrounds is improving in Scotland, but it's not been improving at the rate that we would like it to happen.
All right, let's return to taxes, because you've said, you and many of your colleagues, you want to protect Scottish public services from Tory cuts at Westminster. So why not give those public services like schools and hospitals, like the lady said in that film, they need more money, use your tax-raising powers?
Well, the proposals that Nicola Sturgeon has put forward will raise an additional £2,000 million over the term of the next Parliament, which will go to public services. But you don't end or tackle austerity by taxing the lowest paid people in the country, as Labour propose. If you're introducing taxation, you've got to do two things. You've got to make sure it's fair. You don't give tax cuts to the better off.
So why not have a 50p tax rate then?
For the very reason you saw Nicola Sturgeon in the clip.
Avoidance, but Alex, that sounds like a bit of an excuse.
Sorry, the report that nobody has seriously questioned suggested if we did that in Scotland without the powers that Nicola demonstrated and identified, then we'd end up with less money. Now, nobody seriously imposes a higher tax to end up with less revenue.
Right, so you're not going to do it at the top end, you don't want to do it at the bottom end. You said you're going to have these tax-raising powers, but public services are going to be stopped.
Can I remind you, we are doing it at the top end by not giving the tax cut that George Osborne introduced in the budget, which the SNP voted against in the House of Commons and the Labour Party sat in their hands.
Right. Let's look at other potential areas for raising money to boost public services, which people seem to want. This idea of replacing the council tax with a local income tax, it was clearly in both your 2007 and 2011 manifestos. Why hasn't it happened?
No, the 2011 manifesto committed us to a study. It didn't commit us to replacing. You're right about the 2007 manifesto. We found in 2007 we couldn't get it introduced with the powers we had. Nicola has committed and followed through on the 2011 manifesto. And what she has proposed to do is to change the nature of council tax to increase the number of bands so that once again higher paid people in better off properties are paying more than people across the spectrum. Of course, the commitment that was given...
frozen the council tax and continue to do that, which means they're starved of cash.
Actually, that was the commitment in the 2007 and 2011 manifestos, which has been honoured. And every single penny of that, perhaps to actually an over degree, has been compensated for local government by central government. That has been done. And local authorities in Scotland, who are, incidentally, hard-pressed like public services are everywhere,
saying they want to,
have done incomparably better than local authorities in England and Wales.
Right, well, they also say they've been starved of cash and have had to struggle against it.
Yes, and let's just accept it's this tight spending regime that's been imposed by Tory and coalition governments and the Labour government before them. But local authorities in Scotland have been much better funded than their counterparts in England and Wales.
During the referendum campaign, you said the poll was a once-in-a-generation vote for Scotland. So will you rule out another independence referendum in the next 5 years?
Well, firstly, it's not up to me. And what Nicola Sturgeon has said, who is up to, Nicola and the Scottish people, that she's identified that if we were dragged out of the European Union against the will of the Scottish people, then that would be the change in material circumstances that would justify another poll. And of course that would be the case, because after all, during the referendum we were told that independence would jeopardise Scotland's position in Europe. Now it's been jeopardised by London decisions. And secondly, of course, Nicola last year in the general election said this explicitly, again on the BBC, and the people of Scotland, hearing that commitment, returned 56 out of 59 of Scottish constituencies as SNP members. That's a pretty strong mandate.
Well, to the other three. Anyway, on that basis, we'll leave it there.